Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first session of EUA's special edition of the Funding Forum 2020. We are ready to start this open day with our first session on funding university in times of crisis. Now, yesterday, EUA members discussed funding challenges linked to the COVID-19 crisis and its impact on higher education. They recognized the opportunities for university transformation, but also underlined the concerns linked to the need for sustainable funding for the sector. So this plenary session will look at this now on the side of the funders. Before our moderator takes the floor, I would like to guide you through some technical aspects to make sure you enjoy the webinar. Please make use of the chat at all times, and you can also consult the participants list from there. For questions to our moderator and panelists, please type your questions in the Q&A section, and not forgetting to mention your institution or affiliation. You also have a hands out tab to the right, where you will find, as we progress through the session, a list of resources that are connected to the topic of this morning. You will also find the event booklet there. If you're active on Twitter, please use the hashtag EUA Funding Forum. Finally, if our moderator wishes to ask a question to the participants, you will see a window popping up with response options. Finally, please be informed that the webinar is recorded and will be made available on the EUA YouTube channel. Now, all of these guidelines will be found in the chat as well. Without further ado, I am pleased to give the floor to our moderator, the Director of the Center for Research in Higher Education Policies in Portugal, Pedro Teixeira. Thank you very much, and over to you, Pedro.
Thank you, Nora, and good morning, everyone. And well, a special welcome to our panelists, and thanking them for agreeing to be part of this conversation. And also to everyone that is participating. And from the chat, we're seeing that we have people from all over Europe and beyond. So it's great to have you and that you're willing to join in this very important panel. So as you know, we've been facing in recent months unprecedented challenges for many areas of social life, but certainly higher education hasn't been any exception to this. And as we know, we've faced in universities, we've been facing many challenges in many dimensions, and the financial dimension has increasingly become one very important because finance is structural to anything that we do in universities, but also because we know that the pandemic and the ensuing economic and social crisis is affecting public and private sources, and certainly will affect the resources available to many universities, if not to all universities. So a large part of the purpose of this session is to discuss with different perspectives from across the sector, different perspectives from across Europe, how are public and private organizations that have a strong relationship with the university sector and that have a strong engagement in funding higher education across Europe see the current crisis, how much the current crisis is affecting, how much each of their organization is doing to face this unprecedented crisis, and how do they see the outlook for higher education across Europe in terms of possibilities for funding, in terms of the mix of public and private funding, but also in terms of possible transformations associated with funding mechanisms that may be implemented in higher education. To kick off the discussion, we'll have three great and experienced panelists. Anita Leikonen, who is Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Education and Culture in Finland, since 2013. She has extensive experience at senior level at the Ministry of Education. And prior to her current position, she served as Director General in the Ministry in charge of higher education and science policy development. She has also worked in the field of higher education and was responsible for the implementation of the Bologna process in Finland. So she has been involved in many reforms. So certainly this is a very different challenge from the previous ones, but I'm sure her experience in the past will be very important to address these issues. The second speaker will be Ruth Freeman. She's Director for Society at Science Foundation Ireland since 2018. She has held a series of positions at Science Foundation Ireland with responsibility for overseeing all Science Foundation Ireland research funding programs and management of funded awards, as well as the foundation activities in conjunction with industry and international partners. Prior to joining the foundation, Ruth worked as a researcher in genetics at Trinity College Dublin. And last but certainly not least, Javier Rogla Puig, Global Director of Santander Universities and CEO of Universia Holding of Banco Santander. He oversees a network of more than 1,000 universities and the largest corporate-sponsored higher education support program in the world. Before joining Santander, he served as CEO of Empieza por Educar, Teach First Spain, and was also a member of the Network Advisor Committee for Teach for All. And before that, he has also an experience in management, as senior consultant, and international development and corporate development teams. So as you can see, we have a very diverse and panel, but also with a lot of experience, both in the public and the private sector. And this will be very important to our discussion. But before that, I will give the floor to Thomas Asterman from EUA. We'll just briefly present some latest EUA work on university funding, and we'll just give some context to our discussion. Thomas, over to you.
Thank you very much, Pedro, and also a warm welcome from my side to this funders panel of the EUA Funding Forum. As Pedro already introduced, this panel where we will discuss the expectations also from the funders' perspective. I want to share with you the expectations that the university sector has in terms of the impact of COVID-19. And we did a survey among our members, the National Rectors Conferences and National University Associations, within this last period. And we've got 28 responses. So thanks to all of them for providing their views. And you can see on this slide the systems and countries that have responded. So you can see we cover basically all of Europe. And the first question we asked was to give us a feedback on which income sources have already been impacted by COVID-19 within these first 6 months. And you can see that in 21 systems, particularly services, so rental income from commercial services, and that similar to that, have been impacted in almost all systems. Secondly, the contractual research has been impacted heavily in many systems. 16 of them said that this has been going down. And with contractual research, that is research that universities undertake, for example, with business and industry, but also sometimes with public providers outside of competitive funding. And this is an important aspect, as you will see in the next slides. So bear this in mind, that this is something that has already been affected. The third most affected area, tuition fees from international students, and after that, philanthropic funding. But of course, it's clear that several aspects like public funding have not impacted yet, have been impacted yet. But I show you on this next slide the changes that are expected within the next 2 to 3 years. What is, I think, striking, if you look at this graph, you have on the right side of each of the columns, which shows the expectations of national public funding, competitive funding, and European funding. Now, in all three funding dimensions, you can see that there's a huge uncertainty within the systems of how these funding sources are going to develop. And this is also something that we have sensed in the discussions yesterday on the first day of the funding forum, this uncertainty of where things will be going. You can see also in terms of national public funding, in addition to 8 systems that have a large degree of uncertainty, 77 systems expect funding to go down already in the short term, so within this 2 to 3 year period. 10 think it's going to stay stable, and only 3 think it's going to increase. You have also competitive national funding, uncertainty 7, and 4 think it will go down. 12 systems think it's stable. This is also very often, when we look into more detail, linked to the fact that people expect, in particular, research funding, competitive research funding, not going down. Maybe also linked to the increased trust in universities, that they will also contribute to solving the crisis. And you can see also for European funding a lot of uncertainty where this is going to go. I would say this is also linked to the current discussions and negotiations of the next European budget. And so this gives you already an indication of what systems think will happen in this short-term period. Now, this graph shows you the expected changes in private funding, also in the short term. And again, you see, when it comes to philanthropic funding, more than half said, well, we don't know how this is going to develop. So great uncertainty. The services, again, expectations that this will go down. At least a third of respondents said that. And equally, a very high number expect contractual research to go down. And this was also mirrored in yesterday's session, particularly on European research funding and institutional strategies, where many institutions expected that this is going to go down, and they will shift obviously their strategies to go more for competitive national and European funding. So there will be clearly a huge pressure on competition and success rates for national and European competitive funding. So maybe an interesting aspect also for the discussion. And I think probably to no surprise, over half of the respondents expect tuition fees from international students to be impacted in the short term, not so when it comes to domestic tuition fees. So I think that already gives you a good overview of the expectations, from the university sector across Europe. And one of the questions I thought is also very interesting to share. We also asked views for new areas for investment following the COVID-19 crisis. And again, I would say to no surprise, you can see that almost all systems see an investment need in digital infrastructure, followed by investment in staff training, particularly to get better used to the new environments, and then also physical infrastructure and the campus. There we also had a very interesting session yesterday, which showed that on the one hand, big capital investments seem to be on hold for now, but on the other hand, the campus needs a strong investments to be adapted to a much more flexible environment, also to more hybrid models of delivery of learning and teaching, as well as in research and innovation. So this here as something, I will stop it here and hand back over to Pedro with this short reflection on what the university sector across Europe thinks about it. You will also have the slides available in the resources section.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and thank you for this very insightful overview of perceptions across Europe. And if I would have to highlight 3 issues that I think come out very strongly from what you just presented, I would underline something that you already mentioned, the idea of uncertainty, that I think is very important to our discussion today, but also the idea of differentiation. As we've seen in the previous economic crisis of the late 2000s, different countries have responded differently to the crisis, some of them supporting more higher education, others supporting less. And we also know that in many cases, the crisis affected in an uneven way different institutions within the same system. So I think that's also something that comes out of the responses that we get, that across Europe, people are expecting different things, and I think that's also why it's important to engage in this debate at the European level. And finally, the idea of change, that I think is also very important. Change in terms of the revenues that are coming to higher education, but also changes in the needs and the priorities of the systems and of higher education institutions. Because the crisis that we're facing is also asking institutions to do things differently. And I think that's also will be an important part of our discussion, how funding mechanisms can help universities across Europe to perform differently their mission. So without further delay, I would start a first round of discussion with our panel. And I would start probably by this first idea of, I mean, in this uncertain context, you face with the need to keep moving forward and to address the issues. And so I would like to start by asking, what are you and your organizations doing to help universities in this very critical situation? What kind of special initiatives have you taken to address the crisis and to minimize its impact? Maybe I will start with Anita.
Yes, thank you so much. And it's a great honor and pleasure to be in this session. Of course, I would have loved to see and meet all the participants, but it's not possible, so we have to do it like this. But I think this has, as you were saying, that I've been working for decades at the Ministry of Education and now Education and Culture. And really, this is something that we've never seen before, a kind of crisis. We've seen lots of recessions here and depressions in Finland, but this is something that nobody could expect. And I think one of the key points was really to see, it was so clear how very interdependent the world is today, not only in economic terms, but also in social terms. And then the responses the various systems have taken, they are very interesting to look at. Because here in Finland, there was a great concern with the present government, also with the increasing national debt. And there are some very difficult situations to economic situation in Finland, mainly the kind of degrowth factors we have in the system, which is the aging population and very, very rapidly declining birth rate, and also the massive differences we have geographically in Finland. So we had all these challenges already, and in the government program, this government started 2019, they had some increase in higher education budget and also to research, and especially I would say to development and innovative led research or technology driven research. But when this pandemic hit Finland, we did quite well in the spring, actually, through the lockout to control the pandemic here in Finland. But there was a huge economic and social cost, especially the social cost when there was the closing down of schools. They continued on online education and learning, but it's not the same, obviously, for young kids especially. And then there's a very much now new debt for the state. But there was a big political change within the government, and now it is really that we are seeking sustainable growth through education, competence level raising for the whole population, and investment in R&D and I. And this, I think, was one of the key solutions, how we've been able to create some sort of recovery in the economic sector, but definitely new hope and prospects for our young people. So I probably will have more time later on to come back to the details of what we did. But I think it's not only about how to make economic life prosperous again, but how to make people happier and more resilient than before this crisis.
Thank you very much, Anita. And I think that you raised already several important points, namely regarding, the priorities and how much higher education and research can be a priority, not only throughout the crisis, but in helping our economies and our societies to recover from the crisis and the way they will recover. I'd like also to give the opportunity to Ruth, if you want to address now also this issue.
Yeah, no, I would love to. And again, it's a real pleasure to be here this morning. So thank you very much for having me. And I would echo so much of what Anita said. I mean, in Ireland, we have also been through those very difficult recessions, but I suppose the government did try and maintain that support for research and innovation and for young people to have that sense of hope. But like every other country, nothing had ever hit the system like this pandemic. And we had all of those common issues around the social impact of the schools closing, the universities closing, and businesses closing. I mean, what I see happening in the context of universities is an acceleration of a lot of things that were happening anyway. I mean, already we would have seen, changes in student-staff ratio. We would have had university staff saying that they had too much to do in terms of delivering their teaching, all of the things that they had to deliver, applying for competitive research funding. These are all taking their toll on academics. And now we see that increasing as they're been asked to suddenly switch to digital teaching, often without the resources to do it because this has all happened so quickly. I mean, but before this pandemic, we already saw the difference between online learning, the value of the university degree perhaps sometimes being devalued when people can access an awful lot of information for free online and courses being made available online. We're suddenly seeing that trend accelerate as well. So in many ways, this is throwing the universities forward in all of those trends. I mean, alongside that in Ireland, we've actually, in the midst with this new government that's just taken over, we've created a new department, and it's higher and further education. And in Ireland, that further education is apprenticeships and other types of training that take place outside of the university sector. So again, I think the universities find themselves in a slightly different context here, where, we're now looking at a range of opportunities that will give us the skills that we need to have a functioning economy, but also, as Anita said, a sustainable economy, a resilient economy, an economy where people are valued for the different things that they bring to society. And it's not just about the university. I mean, I think I would just finish by saying, I mean, certainly while we have tried to make funding available through the Irish government to support research and what's gone on in universities, the other side of it is that in many ways universities have never been more at the forefront, because certainly in Ireland, university experts and scientists are on the news every day, and I think never more has the public valued having that deep expertise. So I think there is an opportunity for universities as we move forward, and I'm sure we'll discuss that more as to how they're valued as something that's really central to that functioning, sustainable, resilient society. So that's where I see the opportunity for universities here.
Thank you very much, Ruth. I mean, I think you raised already several important points, and I will just pick on one of them to give the word to Javier, which is the issue of the acceleration of change in higher education. And this is something I think that it's very close to the core of Javier activities and the activities of Universia and Santander network, precisely because a lot of its involvement in higher education has been to promote change. So I would like to give the word also to Javier and see, well, what kind of activities have you been promoting in recent months, or if there are activities that have been fostering more precisely because of the crisis and the context that it created.
Sure, thank you. Well, can I just begin by saying how refreshing it is to listen to Anita and Ruth? And if you ever want to come to South Europe, I mean, and just take over, I'll be more than glad to be part of your taking over candidature. But Santander and Universia, we've been close partners to universities for 20 years now. And yeah, what we have just seen is unprecedented. So I'm not gonna echo what has been said. I'm just gonna say that I fully agree with what has been said. What we've been doing is we've tried to foster collaboration amongst universities in themes such as digital transformations. We understand, at least we look at it as an area where cooperation makes total sense. And by that, I mean collaborating in joining forces in addressing suppliers, in identifying solutions that work at scale, in identifying solutions that work in terms of training. We've also been, we've maintained or philanthropic support, but we've asked universities to address it to the current needs that COVID has surfaced, such as accessibility. I mean, many students in Southern Europe and Latin America, that's mostly where we work, didn't have access to a computer or to internet connection. So accessibility, training for teachers, the most basic stuff, if you will, to ensure continuation of learning. We've also tried to foster some innovative projects around lifelong learning. I mean, we see now that reskilling, especially in markets where unemployment is very high, and where at the same time we're seeing that there are particular jobs that are not being filled by the market in cybersecurity, in data, UX, UI, etc., etc. These are things that universities need to look at as opportunities, but at the same time, we are seeing that other things that are not universities are fulfilling those needs, right? So we've tried to partner with universities to develop responses for those type of needs. And also we've tried to innovate in how we fund research for universities, because COVID has put a lot of pressure to come up with rapid solutions. I mean, COVID is pressing now, not 1 year from now or 2 years from now, right? So we've put together a call for projects that has been inspired by a model called Fast Grants developed in the US that basically allows us to fund projects in a matter of weeks instead of months or years. Over to you, Pedro.
Thank you, Javier. And I mean, and thank you particularly for emphasizing issues that I think are complementary to what already been said, and that I think could be important to address now in a second round of contributions, which is, well, I think we all agree that more money for higher education and research would be important. In many ways, we would be preaching to the choir, as the saying goes, and probably no one attending the session would also disagree with that. But the question is that more money for what? I mean, what would be the priorities? And I think, several of you raised important priorities, but the question is how to balance them. I mean, we need to be more effective with the money that we have. We need to be also more efficient because there is this pressure. I mean, Anita mentioned the pressure on governments in terms of debt, and we know that the pandemic will raise needs in other areas of social life, of course, foremost in health, but also in other areas. But at the same time, Javier, you raise a very important issue that has also been highlighted by the pandemic, which is inequalities, and how much, for instance, the move to online that Anita was mentioning has brought to the surface that the access to those tools is very uneven across our societies, and that may contribute to reproduce inequalities in learning and also inequalities in opportunity in life. So how much should we balance this between, let's say, an emphasis on efficiency that has been very strong in recent years with an emphasis on equity and inclusion, and also with relevance that I think is also very important in what Ruth was saying in terms of the types of learning, and that Javier also alluding. So how do you see the priorities for funding mechanisms? How do you see the outlook for that? Maybe Anita?
Yes, thank you. And a very interesting discussion. And I think one of the lessons learned from this crisis is that you build a sustainable system during the normal times, because we have been able to come by with the pandemic because we have good infrastructure. We have our teaching staff for the school system. They are trained at university level. We have invested extra funding for retraining teachers in digital skills for years. And all schools, they have the good working network. And our kids, basically, they have good access to all the stuff they need. But of course, we see, because we follow and monitor very closely what is happening with this online education that happened so very suddenly. And we can see that those who did well in normal times, they did well during the crisis. And then we see big differences between families, how the families can support the young kids. And to some extent, this is also true in higher education level. Somehow we seem to think that they are young adults and they are these natives in the digital world, but it is not so. We hear of well-being of students getting worse and worse. And we know that learning doesn't happen in isolation. You need social interaction so much. So this is a big thing that we can follow. But also this giving extra funding to research and to universities, it doesn't come without a label. And this is the thing. What is the balance? And I'm very happy that there was also the political decision within the government that they stick to their government program where we have big educational reforms. We are increasing the compulsory schooling age and making the upper secondary level education in the general and vocational path free of charge for the students. So they will be covered all the tuition materials and how they get to the educational institutions. This will go on, and this is a historic reform. And then also the importance, how we see the higher education, that they actually have responsibility for the whole chain of building competencies in Finland, because teachers are educated in universities. So they really have the responsibility that the whole educational continuum, starting with early childhood education and care, is of good quality. And this is very important and also part of the resilience. But then the research, development and investment, definitely a strong emphasis on this collaboration, new types of partnerships between universities and collaboration with companies. And we have a good projects already in place, but I would say that the kind of priority number one is to make use of university research, R&D and education, is to create sustainable growth, increased employability and also productivity in our economic structures. This is the kind of short cycle view of the whole system at this point. But one last point I want to make, we are also, the government is preparing a special report on how to develop our education system towards 2040. And we will give this report to the Parliament in the beginning of next year. And that'll be interesting to see how far we can actually see now, what are the kind of further development goals. We are now talking about raising the competence level of the whole population through these reforms and the reform in continuous learning. But the universities, they're kind of, I would say, the long-term task, how this will be taken into account, that is a big issue here in Finland. And I'm very happy that we are actually having these discussions at the international level, because we are not alone with these challenges. Thanks.
I think you're not alone, Anita. But it's always so wonderful to hear about what's happening in Finland in education, because I think a lot of the world look to you to lead the way. So it's always wonderful to hear.
Ruth, if you want, please go ahead.
Just to continue. I mean, I suppose you asked us about where is it going to go? Because
exactly.
we're all going to be facing challenges. Budgets are not going to be unlimited. And even though a lot of countries in Europe are borrowing to fund what's this immediate need, how are we going to make sure that there is sustainable funding for universities when there's all these other demands on the public purse going forward? I mean, one thing I would reflect on, in Science Foundation Ireland, we recently ran one of the national COVID-19 rapid response calls, a bit like what you talked about, Javier, in terms of getting money out quickly to solve an immediate problem. And we're still in the midst of that, but that is a very right now issue. But I think if we look around the world and maybe even in a couple of years, when we get a chance to look back on what happened here, we will see, because this was a crisis and everyone was acting very quickly, that we didn't do things in the most efficient and effective way. And probably when we look back, we will see that there was, I mean, maybe money wasted is too strong a word, because I think, you know, it's a crisis and one has to do your best effort at the time to try and get solutions. But I think in a way, it's an experiment. And, you know, as academics, we can look back at this very unusual period and say, okay, are there things that we're doing ordinarily that are actually a bit like this? And I think when we look in Europe at efficiencies around research, we can still do better. I mean, we have made strides toward that common research area, but I feel absolutely certain that we could do more to make sure that we are getting efficient results out of that entire pot of public and private money. So I think that's one thing we need to think about. And the fact that we've been forced online in many ways has shown us that we can work together maybe more seamlessly than we thought, and we're not as constrained by place. So how do we take that and make sure that we keep those positives and really spend public money and private money very, very effectively? I mean, the other thing I would say, I mean, Science Foundation Ireland, where I work, is a competitive research funder. But there is little point in putting competitive money into a university system that is crumbling or giving it to people who are not able to function. So I think, you know, looking at the system as a whole is very important. That there's no point looking at these funding streams going in isolation. We have to understand that they are working together. both, you know, in the university system, but then also linking to that broader system of education, you know, that whole sort of continuum that Anita spoke about. And then I suppose these other types of learning that we've touched on. And again, accessibility and diversity should be at the heart of that. There must have been some good things that have come out of this. If we can conquer that digital divide, how do we actually make this more inclusive rather than less inclusive? So I think, you know, that efficiency piece, you know, there must be some good things. Let's look back at the money that went into COVID and say, well, you know, how would we have done that differently if we had more time? And then what lessons can we take forward into, particularly in a European context, how we might work together even better?
Thank you so much, Ruth. I mean, I would love to go deep in some of the points, but I first would like to give the chance to Javier to also bring his view in terms of how he sees the priorities changing, possibly in terms of funding systems.
Yes, thank you. Let me begin by saying that whenever you want to win an argument in education discussions, you just say, this is how Finland does it, and then that's an argument won. And now, I think that, I mean, we need to come to terms with the fact that resources will be restrained for a long time, and that there's no way that higher education will get more resources than before without doing new stuff. I mean, I don't think there's any way around that. And I think that leads us to two things that we should work on. One is to what things can we take out from universities that will unleash the power? For instance, bureaucracy, at least in many of the universities that we work with, bureaucracy that's pressured by governments, by regulations, by funders, etc., is crippling. So can we take some of the bureaucracy out of universities? Can we help them be more agile? What things can we take out from the plate? I mean, that's one thing that would not take more resources, but will probably unleash resources that are currently not well spent. And the second thing is that I think that there's going to be, societies will be faced with new needs, and universities must look at how can universities fulfill those new needs. And it's pretty much linked with the first idea, and then what needs to happen for universities to respond to these new needs. And again, reskilling is one that's that comes to mind, but new needs in terms of research, patents, etc., and how can we unleash the assets and the brain power and the human resources that universities, which by the way, I mean, universities have one thing going on for them still, which is huge societal goodwill and credibility. And again, that can change, and we're seeing how populist governments are attacking universities, mainly because they are independent. But still, in many of European societies, universities have huge goodwill. So again, they have something going on for them. It's not all bad news. And I'll leave it up for discussion, if you will, Pedro.
Thank you, Javier. I mean, all of you have emphasized the need for change and dimensions of change. And as we know, funding mechanisms can be a very powerful engine for change. So the question for me would be, how can funding sources, both public and private sources, contribute to that change? How do you see this? Do you expect that funding mechanisms will promote more certain type of activities, sort of more target funding, more funding related to outcomes and performance? Do you think that we should go back to times where you would give an envelope, a financial envelope to institutions and then give them the autonomy to do things. And I know that I'm being provocative because Anita is already willing to respond, but I think that I think that's a very important issue, because I suspect that among us and among the audience there would be very different answers for this. Some would regard targeted funding as intrusive, as limiting the capacity, the strategic capacity of universities, and others who see it as an insurance against waste. So, how do you envisage a funding system that would promote change, the necessary change in higher education at this stage? Anita?
Yes, thank you. This is really the kind of eternal question, I think, in every system. And how do you make sure that the universities are autonomous enough so that they can actually come up with the kinds of solution not even the wisest government can ask them to produce? So we always look for surprises. So you need to have this very strong institutional autonomy. But then, of course, this kind of pressure for targeted money is there. And I think this is becoming an issue more and more, because as Pedro was saying earlier on, we have very high demand for public funding in other sectors, especially in aging societies like Finland and most European countries. So there will be increase in public funding needs in the fields of health and social care, and we have to just take them for granted to some extent. We are engaged. We've been engaged in a major reform in that sector for about 12 years, and now we are just expecting it to happen. But we've been in that position for a long time. So it's a very difficult situation, and it has to do with how can we finance our universities in the future. In many European countries, universities are totally dependent on the public purse. And this is a big issue. Here in Finland, we put quite a lot of public money to universities. But then if we want to do more, we need also more sources for financing. And of course, we encourage universities to interact and collaborate with the business and industry so that they actually bring money into the system. But there you always have the target. It's not money for sake of funding universities or basic research, if you like. But then also the importance of European collaboration and also international cooperation at large. Because now I think we will see in hindsight, at least, that we've been all doing the same stuff in EU member states. We've been funding the same kinds of projects just to get out of the crisis. And it would have made so much more sense to do it properly so that there would be kind of European counterpart to the very big investment for example, the US. After all, they are still putting a lot of money in research, R&D. So the kind of European answers would be much sought after. And then the big thing is that now we can be fairly happy, I would say, for the few coming years, because national funding in many systems is increasing, and then we have the European Recovery and Resilience Fund, and everybody's, I suppose we are all writing our growth plans to get the maximum out of it. But what happens then when there's the time that the governments will be forced more or less to stabilize the public economies? What is then the kind of new way we can think of for the funding mechanisms for universities? And what if our students are not willing to study in our domestic or national university systems, whether they are now skilled enough to take the degree courses online at the global level? So what is the kind of earning system for the unis in the years to come. And I would just like to wrap this up by saying that universities need to be very, very useful in the eyes of the wide public, because they are paying for it in our countries, in our systems. And so we need to have results. So we are not thinking here of giving the kind of open account for universities to use, but there's the kind of social acceptance that has to be earned. And this is the big thing. So going online with the changing perhaps behavior pattern of our young people, both students and researchers, and then the coming bad years which will be there. Thanks.
Thank you, Anita. Ruth?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's absolutely true, Anita. And I suppose, like many, we've tried to take a bit of a portfolio approach. So looking at different funding streams, some which are much more targeted and some which enable that autonomy. And as you say, the ability to think of things in a very curiosity-driven way and in a way that wouldn't necessarily align to any government strategy document today. And I would say we've taken sort of two angles on that. One thing is around the career stage of the researcher, because what we find is, particularly with those early career researchers, it's really important to have that freedom. Because when you look back at a lot of big and important discoveries, they do tend to happen in those early career years. So I think to give people freedom, particularly early on, to really be creative is very important for us. I mean, clearly, if you're making a very large investment of tens of millions into a national research centre, you know, that's going to be aligned to a government priority in a very meaningful and close way. And I think that makes sense. So I think we have to find a balance between that ability to think freely and just have that completely autonomous research and an alignment piece. I mean, another thing I would say after working in research, you know, for 2 decades, is I have not met that many researchers who don't think about an impact of what they're doing. Sometimes they don't talk about it that much, but for most of them, that's why they get up every day and go and do what is not an easy job. They are motivated by trying to help, by trying to make society better, by trying to make people's lives better. So actually, I think this idea of missions and challenge funding will be a very important pillar over the next decade. It's certainly something that we are already doing in Ireland, and I think the EU mission structure aligns to what's happening in a lot of other countries. And I think what's important about those missions is that they engage people with what we are all trying to achieve. So, I mean, you could take the UN Sustainable Development Goals as missions. A lot of funders will look at those, but we also have our own mission boards in the EU. And I think that explains very clearly to the public that even if we have quite a broad range of research going on, a lot of it will ultimately align to these missions, which I think everyone can support. And again, that underlines the value of the university, which enables us to keep that public funding flowing. Because for us as the funders, or for people like Anita working in government, it is a constant battle against all of the other needs to make the case on behalf of the university system. So the better armed we are, the more likely it is that we can maintain and hopefully grow those budgets. But every year, even maintaining a budget is a challenge when you work in public office, because there's always other people looking for it. So again, I would come back to a point I made earlier. There's never been a better time to talk to the public about science. Science is everywhere, research is everywhere, social science is everywhere. So let's talk to the public about this benefit and where a lot of that reserve of knowledge sits across Europe, and it's in our universities.
Thank you, Ruth. Javier?
Yeah, no, I mean, I was just enjoying listening because I fully agree with the main ideas, which to me are, I mean, universities must outreach to societies, and that is something that not all of them do all of the time. The second idea to me is that, I mean, Charlie Munger once said that if you can work on incentives, don't work on anything else. And but at the same time, I'm reminded of Alice in Wonderland and finding the cat and asking which way to go, and then the cat going, well, where is it that, I mean, what's your end destination? And she said, well, I really don't know. And then the cat says, well, then it doesn't really matter which way you take, right? And that's true. I mean, Anita was just telling us how Finland has or is producing a 2040 outlook, right? Then that gives a playing ground, not only for universities, but for other players. And then you can start thinking about what's my role within this playing ground, what's my contribution in this exercise, right? But if you don't have that, then what happens, right? So I think that universities must ask for these priorities, clarity for societal priorities, and engage actively on those designs and conversations, which again goes back to the idea of outreach and of just going outside the institution and engaging with societies in strategic discussion, right?
Thank you. I cannot resist playing the devil's advocate here, because, well, being at EUA Forum and with many people from universities participating and listening to you, I'm sure that many of them would say, well, but why don't you trust universities to do what they should do? I mean, is it an issue of trust, or is it an issue of political effectiveness, as Ruth was saying? Is it an issue of governance and organization? Why do you think it's more important, especially in the current situation, in the current crisis, to privilege more target funding than to go a longer way, in a way that would give money to the institutions and then give them the flexibility to decide which ways would be more effective or more relevant regarding their specific circumstances?
Yeah. Yes, this is the big thing, and I'm sure that the participants in the audience from Finland, they would disagree with many of the things I'm saying. But I think we did a big reform in the university sector about 10 years ago, when they were kind of given their own institutional autonomy very strong, and also the responsibility for minding their own and taking care of their own assets was given to universities. But that also entailed a very big demand and requirement of strategic leadership to university level, kind of institutional strategic leadership. And this is something that we still need some room for development, I would say, at the institutional level. How they see themselves in the future, and do they have the kind of trust in themselves that this is the way we are going, so they are not the wanderer in the Alice in Wonderland who doesn't know really which way to take, when it doesn't make any sense, and you can't really talk about priorities, because universities, some of them, they really have to invest in becoming future-proof in their research and in education. So they just have to be able to make these plans for several years, and not relying only and expecting the kind of automatic funding from the state, because there are really the big needs in society that we all have to take into account. And the competition for public money will become fierce in many of our systems because of these kind of social situations we have. So I think there is a trust to universities, and we can see now our politicians, they give money to project funding, which is project funding. And in our case, they have increased the capacity of university system to take in new students, because we can see that the economic structures in Finland are changing in a way that more and more young people would need a higher education qualification enabled to be employed and to create added value to the economic system. So this is the big thing, that we need something out of the system which is paid from the taxpayer's pocket. And when we expect results from all publicly funded systems, from basic education, for example, or from the healthcare system. We wouldn't be happy taxpayers in putting more money into the system and seeing that things are not going to the right direction. And this is true also of universities. But we have to take the kind of regulation environment into account, how we treat our universities, whether they are autonomous actors and they could be more strategic and outreach to society, to business and industry, to global level is very important. But they also have to take kind of reasonable steering from the government because of this link. This is, I think, perhaps this is not the final solution to this discussion. There might be need to discuss this in the coming years, but this is the case, how I see it from the government officials' perspective.
I think, if I may come in, that often
Absolutely.
it doesn't end up being quite as black and white as either the universities being autonomous or the government sort of dictating what they should do, because certainly in a country like Ireland, and I think in a lot of European countries because of their size, there's a dialogue there, so that neither thing can happen in isolation. And of course, universities are part of the citizens of a country who are also part of saying where they want to see money spent. So universities don't operate in a bubble separated from the rest of society either. And I mean, as I said earlier, a lot of universities are interested in the kind of social challenges that the government wants solved. So there isn't necessarily two sets of agendas here. In fact, there's two quite closely allied agendas going on. And I think sometimes it's just how we can better coordinate. And often I think it's the messaging around that rather than the actuality. I think in many ways the two agendas are closely aligned. So I think that's a good starting point. I mean, the other thing I would say, I mean, Anita said it very well, but when you look at university leadership, it's a challenging role. I mean, you were talking about groups of academics who work in communities of peers and equals, both in their own system and across systems, and that can be challenging. So often when we would speak to university leadership, they would welcome strategic guidance from the government, because in fact what it helps with is alignment. And certainly when you get that alignment, it means you can get a critical mass of people working towards something. And again, what we're all dealing with at the moment in COVID is kind of a really interesting example, because there's no doubt, even though I said perhaps we haven't done things as efficiently as we could, the progress that research has made in the last less than 9 months is phenomenal. So that does show what a common purpose can deliver. So I wouldn't see it as such a black and white sort of argument where we're at odds. I think in fact our agendas align. I think we can probably help each other more in the communication that agenda aligns. And I think a lot of it is about that outreach, to explain what's going on. And sometimes I think we shoot ourselves in the foot by kind of putting these two agendas as running counter to each other, when in fact really they don't. And the motivation for most people in the wider system, those motivations are in fact the same, and they align very well.
Yeah, and if I may just wanted to make a reflection, which is that goodwill and credibility from society must be on every day, and society needs are changing, and society problems are changing. So you cannot rely on the fact that for a long time, universities, and rightly so, have been most credible and trusted institutions. I mean, you must renew that social contract and that social goodwill every day. And things that go against that, youth unemployment, especially when they have college degrees, or underemployed, very complex ways of transmitting the value of basic research. And again, I'm not against basic research. I think it's crucial, and it's the base for a lot of applied research. But we must find a way to make that understandable by societies, and that, I mean, that is something that you cannot outsource, or you cannot let any other one do it for you. And I think that if I had to do a suggestion, and I do, and also recognizing, I mean, I think that university leadership being highly complex might be a great understatement. I mean, I've been working with rectors, vice chancellors, rectors, and vice chancellors for 4 years now, and I'm amazed at the agendas, the wide range of topics that they must deal with, the challenges, and the very small wiggle room that they actually have. So I recognize that, but at the same time, if I was to make a suggestion, would be to not leave the outreach to societies for granted, and build that credibility, that goodwill, and that understanding of the value out of universities every single day, because societies change and the priorities and needs change, and we as individuals are subjected to a lot of inputs every day, and things are getting more and more complex.
If I can just follow on, Javier just said, I think at the same time, I think we all agree that yes, there is a need for universities to do more and to be more effective, and I suspect no rector would disagree with that. But at the same time, we need to understand that universities are facing very difficult situations in many cases. I mean, they have suffered a significant decline in terms of their revenues, normal revenues, and at the same time, they're being pressured to do other things, and even to contribute. I mean, many universities have been contributing through their scientific capacities, for instance, to the pandemic effort, in terms of testing, in terms of supporting the health sector. So I think that that goes along what something that several of you have said, and Ruth in particular, that this is also important to make the case for the importance of university. I mean, even we could say that the quality of our health staff is also because of the quality of education, and because of the future of healthcare also depending on the quality of university education and research nowadays, because that will have an impact. So I would. There's several things that I still like to raise if I can, but one of the things that I think is also very important across Europe, and because this is a European discussion in many senses, is all this debate about the recovery of the crisis and the recovery fund and the plans. How do you see the arguments regarding the importance of higher education and science? And underneath the sort of the rhetorical statements that everyone makes, that higher education and research are very important, but do you really think that there will be a chance in your countries, in the environments in which you operate, to make a strong case that higher education and research are critical for the recovery funds?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, because we have to follow also the kind of national goals the Commission has been given us through the steering period, the semester system. So there is a very strong, I would say it's a demand and requirement that we need investments in R&D and I. So that's going to be a big part of our recovery program. And also then the continuous learning, because we know that we can't really have this kind of successful transformation to follow the Green Deal or digital economy of the European Union if we don't upskill and retrain our people. So there's very obvious needs for big investment in the education, in R&D and I, and we have actually kind of more or less thought about the kind of allocations internally already to this direction. But of course, the main emphasis will be in the Green Deal. But I think the question is how to make sure that everybody understands that you have to reform the education and R&D system before you can have this successful big transfers or transformation your economic structures. And this is the thing, so that we don't end up arguing with each other whether to put more money in Green Deal or digital infrastructure or digital economic structures if you don't have the human capital to make it true. And this is the big thing. But I would be very optimistic about our national plan, so that it relies really on building our human capital and social capital, which is so very, very important as we see now during the crisis especially.
I think there is a chance as well. It's going to be difficult. There's no doubt about it. There's going to be lots of competing demands. But I think something that the university sector can give to society is hope, because it's about young people and it's about the future and it's about innovation and new ideas, and all those are things that we need now. But we do have to be realistic. I mean, Pedro, you talked about the fact that the sector has been very challenged and it's given a lot already. But that is true of all sectors at the moment. So I think we need to be realistic that is true for everyone, that businesses have struggled and done more, all different sectors have, as well as higher education contributing. I mean, for me, what we must do is make sure that we win the big argument about the value of the overall sector, and not get bogged down in what I would call the minutiae of things like targeted funding versus blue skies research. That's an argument that we seem to have been having in Ireland for years. And of course, the reality is what we need to talk about is the big picture of what universities deliver. And it's everything from those well-educated healthcare workers and teachers to keeping the economy going, to giving young people an education that gives them a social conscience and that they understand the issues that we're all facing globally, to dealing with climate change. Like it's not a difficult case to make in many ways, but yet we end up arguing about how that money is going to be spent. And I saw a clip recently from the States of one of the Congress women there talking about a scarcity mindset. And when you have a scarcity mindset, you fight amongst yourselves. And the important thing is that we try to get ourselves out of that mindset, even though that's how we might feel. We might feel that everything is very scarce and everything is very stretched. But if we argue sort of about where that stretched funding is going to go within the system, I think we will lose the battle to grow the overall budget going into higher education and universities. So I think, it's where things like the European Universities Association and national associations for higher education can really help to create that one voice. And yes, of course, there's going to be competition then in the sector as to where funding goes. That's normal. But let's do that afterwards. Let's do that after we win the argument that the overall sector is absolutely critical. I mean, I guess none of us would be here working in it if we didn't passionately believe in it. You know, we are all the backers and the biggest supporters of the sector, and you know that's our job every day. But I think sometimes we need to be more unified in championing the whole system, not just our little bit of the system, because as I said earlier, it doesn't work if only one bit is functioning. So I think we need to think about that big picture, and let's all tell that story. And that's the story that resonates with the public as well. So, you know, it's a win-win if we can do that and we can all get on that same page.
Yeah, if I can add two things, I mean, minor to what Gita and Ruth have shared, which I fully agree with. One is the idea of what can be done without more resources, right? What changes in regulation, in etc., would unleash more impact from universities. And I think that, I mean, whilst fighting for more resources and whilst waiting for more resources, what could we do as a sector and ask for that actually don't entail more transfers, but that would allow us to make more impact. And the second idea is around I mean, inviting critical voices into the discussion. I mean, sometimes it might feel as we are discussing amongst believers, and we are in an echo chamber. I mean, only by inviting critical voices and fully understanding the arguments against the case that we're making, can we actually win the conscience and the heart of society. And sometimes I feel that we lack that empathy, if you will, for the contrarian case, right? So yeah, that's just my 2 minors.
Thank you. As we're coming towards the end of our session, but we still have just a few minutes. And one of the ideas that cut across the discussion was the idea of change. And some of you mentioned, well, back in February, March, we were dealing with an emergency situation. So basically, we just tried, as many parts of society, but certainly in the case of universities, to adapt to a very challenging situation. But now we need to start planning ahead, and we need to start thinking about what would be the priorities. And so if I could ask you for 1, 2 priorities that you would have for the coming months, what do you think would be the critical issues that you would be concerned? What would be your advice to a university leader in terms of what would be the critical junctures that they should address? For instance, one of the topics that has been raised in the Q&A and that I've been following is the issue of digital skills. This was also present in the slides that Thomas Esterman showed at the beginning. So would that be one of them, or pedagogical innovation maybe, or reskilling of workers and graduates due to the transformations in the labor market, engagement with the regional environment? So what would be 1 or 2 priorities that you think would be important to bear in mind?
Yeah, a big issue. I would certainly hope, if I could hope and wish, the kind of courage for university systems to be innovative and be wise, and also think ahead, because there will be challenging years, as we all been discussing now, due to the kind of societal and economic changes, and look for extra sources of funding, be innovative and industrious in that work. I can see that we don't perhaps make full use of European funding or global funding. And why I say this is that we do not always see that perhaps we duplicate work. We could, through international collaboration, we could be so much stronger if we didn't try to do everything within our national systems. And this is, of course, a big political issue also. How much do you want to have and believe that you can have a university system which covers all the fields and is in the top league at the global ratings and in everywhere? Or do we trust international collaboration, European collaboration more and more? And definitely this kind of engagement with society and the economy is absolutely important, because we are facing very, very difficult years in trying to and upskill our people. And there we have to have efficiency, and also the kind of deliverables of universities, they need to change. And there we need some investments, but also I would say what Javier was mentioning earlier on, that how we all players in the field thought about those things and reforms we could actually make true without extra funding. Or is the system perfect, just lacking a little bit of funding? So this is my challenge for the coming years.
I mean, you've both listed an awful lot of good potential priorities, but I guess everything can't be a priority. I mean, I think looking at what we managed to do over the last few months and taking some of those efficiencies forward is absolutely one thing that we need to do. I think the other thing for me is looking globally at early career researchers who I would see as a really critical part of the system in terms of particularly new ideas and innovation. Is there an opportunity for universities in Europe to try and bring some of those academics and those researchers into the system now, when maybe there aren't so many other opportunities in other places? And I do think there are opportunities to get funding to do that, particularly when their areas of research might broadly relate to things like the Green Deal and climate change and big societal issues. So I think for me, investing in early career people who will hopefully stay and be part of a very successful system would be a priority. I think we talked about digital in those early slides, but actually I think, the campus as well, one of the things that we have learned, is that learning online perhaps isn't a perfect solution, that we need that blend. And certainly where I come from in the sciences, that physical learning will always be part of it. So I would say to universities as well, thinking about how their campuses can be adapted will be part of their priorities over the coming years, so that they can be more resilient and perhaps be more efficient in the future.
Thank you. And for us at Santander universities, our priorities for the forthcoming years will be around scholarships. I mean, only this year we'll be granting more than 80,000 scholarships, and we are focusing more and more on inclusion criteria to fight inequality, and also on skilling and reskilling. I mean, programs that can increase employability. Our second priority is on fostering entrepreneurship. We deeply believe that it's a fantastic complement to university studies. I mean, it's experiential, teamwork, it faces with the market, etc., etc. So we are very keen on fostering entrepreneurship. And for Universia, our priorities will be on supporting universities on the digital transformation efforts, especially fostering collaboration amongst them and sharing best practices, ideas, etc., etc. And on supporting learners both with orientation and access to internships, scholarships, and employment opportunities. So that's our priorities for the forthcoming years.
Well, thank you so much. We could go on because there's been a lot of interesting issues raised by all of you. I think that we have. I think the discussion in the Q&A section is also quite nicely overlapped with many of things that we were discussing. So I think that we were most of the time on the same page, although I'm sure there are different perspectives. But I think that the core message has been very strong and also very much shared by all of us. And I think that as we said in the beginning, we are facing an enormous crisis that is affecting all dimensions of social life. And it's also affecting higher education, but it's also creating an opportunity for higher education. And in the last months, we have seen how higher education and science have played a critical role in helping society to face these challenges. And I think that a lot of the inputs were very relevant in terms of how funding mechanisms are changing and also helping the universities to tackle these different priorities and also the way, the need to change in the way we operate in universities, how we fulfill our main missions. And I think that the one of the messages that I would like to underline is funding mechanisms should evolve in a way that would strengthen higher education as a key sector and not weaken it. And I think that would be one of the things that we would take for our national debate, but also for our European debate. One of the things that I think was also very important in our discussion is we are learning with each other. We are engaging in a European discussion. So the purpose of these sessions, of course, is not that each of you tell us what we should do in our countries, but is to highlight the kind of issues, the kind of challenge, the kind of concerns, the kind of solutions that you are discussing. And as several of you highlighted, a lot of this is common to us. So I think this was again another opportunity for EUA to do a big service to our community, because in this critical moment for higher education in Europe, I think EUA is playing an important role again in providing a platform for us to discuss, to meet, and to, as much as possible, to try to find common ground in how to face these huge challenges. So for the final word, I'll give the word to Enora. But before that, just to thank all the panelists, to thank EUA for the invitation. It was, as usual, a pleasure, and it's tremendously important to be part of this event. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Pedro. Thank you very much to all of the panelists for the excellent discussion. I would simply like to thank all the participants for their participation this morning, and also invite everyone to join this afternoon at 2 p.m. where we continue the discussion and actually bring it up to the European level. So we will discuss with Commissioner Maria Gabriel as well as MEP Christian Eller. And we will have the sector's views represented by our president, EUA President Michael Murphy, as well as the president of the Dutch University Association, Peter Duisenberg. So this has been a really strong dimension of EUA's work in the recent years and months, and we continue fighting for good outcomes in the currently finalizing negotiations for the next funding period at the EU level. So please join us at 2 p.m. for this exciting opportunity. Again, many thanks to everyone, and hopefully see you a bit later. Goodbye.